is Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH2503 Community Media Production, and this is the overview for the 17th lecture, and the title is Community Cohesion, Problems and Issues. And what we're going to be looking at is the kind of idea about the way in which we think that we ought to and have in the past regenerated communities or redeveloped communities. And particularly when communities are seen as being problematic and they've broken down. So I've put together the PowerPoint presentation, which as usual, I don't share, but the lecture notes there are available to download now via the DMU Commons Wiki, which is wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. So, one of the overriding things about a sense of community is that it's often tied in with strong notions of nostalgia and kind of a yearning for a past that maybe never existed. But there are certain attributes that people kind of fondly remember about their youth or their experience of former times, to do with a kind of close-knit sense of family, a sense of locality, a sense of belonging, and a kind of sense of freedom, and a kind of, you could leave doors open and all those kind of neighbours would check in on each other. So there's a kind of neighbourliness that people remember. And often this kind of nostalgia is driving social policy. So it kind of defines and shapes the way that we think about what we expect from a modern or a new community, a kind of a community which is fit for purpose in the contemporary world. So we've got this kind of tussle, if you like. And what I'll do in this lecture is I'll give you some examples from my past and my experience of growing up in a city which is basically a problematic community and still is to to great extent. Something that is at the forefront of deindustrialisation, at the forefront of social change, ethnic change, cultural change, a kind of sense of a loss of the past, of the kind of former glory days of the past. Identity in where I come from, which is Liverpool, is tied into things like sport and prowess with football teams, industrial and music, and kind of an achievement which was the glory days have gone, if you like. So what we look at is the idea that kind of modern communities are often, it's what's described, it's an oxymoron. You can't have a problematic community because by definition it's either a community or it isn't, and a community can only be a good community, so the argument goes. So what do we mean then when policymakers and government and local authorities are charged with changing communities and reinvesting in communities and shaping communities through their policies for things like housing and business and access to services and education and all of those kind of social and civic priorities. So we'll look at some ideas which have run through the debate about social poverty, one of which is kind of the ever-present concern about pauperism and how people can shift and fall down the ladder of social economic well-being and fall into being destitute and homeless and being paupers and kind of develop a kind of coarseness and roughness, which is always something which challenges the middle classes, if you like, challenges the sensibilities and the politeness of a mainstream civic society. So there's a debate about, and this has raged since Victorian times, a kind of moralism about the deserving and the undeserving poor, something which is characterised by kind of those people who are seen as workers and those people who are seen as shirkers. And this came back in the kind of fairly pernicious way in the coalition government with George Osborne and David Cameron, projecting an appeal to a middle class who were aspiring for affluence and blaming the poor for being in the situation that they're in. Now, this is all kind of complicated by a sense of neighbourliness, a kind of sense of change through technology, a sense of change through industrialisation, a kind of growth of kind of one of the changes that we've seen locally and talked about locally in Leicester is kind of the influx of immigrant communities and then the flight of white middle class people to the county and the suburbs. So there's kind of concentrations of poverty and concentrations of affluence, which kind of then becomes a perpetual self-reinforcing cycle of deprivation and kind of expectations about poverty. well, they would be like that because they're from that area. They're from this particular place, so therefore they must be a bit, thick or a bit wherever. It's kind of it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And so what I want to think about is the kind of responses that corporate and government organisations are encouraged to and have used in the past. And what prompted me to kind of go down this road is there was an article in this week's Guardian by George Monbiot about how communities can take back control for themselves, and that they can articulate an alternative view of community which isn't guided by the state or isn't guided by bureaucracy, and is something which is a kind of grassroots up, bottom up community development approach. The interesting thing was in the article is that community media again was not mentioned. It was not used as an example to demonstrate and show how productive, how purposeful, how people find meaning and input and a sense of community and belonging through community media activities. And that is fundamentally our challenge, to use and to promote community media as a vehicle for community development. So I've got some examples which we can look at, and we can think about how communities the argument really needs to be changed, certainly in terms of social policy and social regeneration considerations, but also in terms of the way media studies and media academics and media policy is defined almost in isolation from its social purpose and its grassroots and participative social purpose. So there's some good examples that we can look at, and we'll tie it up with thinking about the kind of what our networks and sense of belonging can achieve, and what we kind of can do differently in the future. So as I say, those notes are up online. It's based on chapter 13 by Susan in the May book, Susan McGregor, The Problematic Community. So I've used that quite extensively. I've not identified any viewing yet, but I will do. Might even just put together a music playlist. I'm toying with that for the basis for the first year's lecture on a similar kind of theme. So I might just share kind of popular songs that have kind of been kind of identified with these issues. So those notes are up, and I'll see you at the lecture on Thursday.